Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights.
I just visited a little incredibly innovative manufacturer here that works for Tesla and others in some really high-performing, high-quality manufacturing. But I talked also about the fact that they are going to be impacted if a shutdown of the rail system continues for much longer. And that's something that is an impact right across the country, from workers to businesses to farmers to consumers who are going to be impacted. That's why we are on this. We're taking it so seriously. The Minister is engaged directly. We are not taking this lightly, obviously, because Canadians across the country are worried about it, and we will have more to say shortly on what we're doing to make sure that the right solution is found.
Well, we made it very clear that we would always oppose back-to-work legislation. I made that very clear to Justin Trudeau. I looked him right in the eyes and said, we will never support any back-to-work legislation. Never count on us. You'll have to go to Conservatives, who are the enemy of working people. You can go to yourself, because we know that Liberals have sold out working people again and again with back-to-work legislation, forcing them back to work, undermining their rights. So if that's the path the Liberals want to go, we're going to fight them every step of the way. We made it very clear. I said, whether it's confidence or not, I don't care. We're going to vote against any measure that attacks working people. Back to work, binding arbitration, we'll be voting against it. We'll be fighting it every step of the way. I made that abundantly clear to Justin Trudeau, and I make that clear again today.
Welcome back to Policy and Rights here on Depictions Media Radio. I'm your host, Michael Clogs. And in today's episode, we're going to hear a bunch of things, starting with the railway shutdown. And you just heard two opposing sides in two short clips that we played ahead of this, with Justin Trudeau saying that the decision that was made for binding arbitration between the railways and the Teamsters union, as enacted by Steven MacKinnon, the Labour Minister, we will hear from him in a press conference in a little bit, that it is a wonderful and great thing, and that it shows that the government is willing to do what it takes to look out for Canadians. And the flip side to that is, of course, Jagmeet saying that binding arbitration is in violation of the rights of workers and only helps to protect the corporations. So the long and short of it is that the majority of Canadians are looking for those goods that would be transported back and forth via those railways, and that we are also dependent on the economy that it brings to us. That by cutting off the railway, that we're also cutting off part of our own economy. And with that being said, that in the end, that I would think that the larger corporations, because of increased inflation and increase pricings to the consumer, that the longer the strike would last, the bigger benefit that larger corporations would actually receive. Just my humble opinion. Okay, so we're going to hear from Minister MacKinnon about that, and we already heard from just the party leaders for the NDP and for the Liberal government via our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, with how polarized the situation really is going to be, where labor versus government is concerned. So we are also going to hear today from the Minister of Environment as they're gearing up for another COP. And this one is going to be, we're going to be focusing in on Colombia, and there is going to be a news conference there as they're talking about the, what I like to call climate evolution, which means that the human factor means that we are part of nature and that we are more or less on the ride of what nature is going to hand us, then we are in control of nature. One of the issues that I see with the whole idea of climate change and the way it is being presented to us is that some government, some corporation is going to come up with the answer that's going to save humanity. Well, the fact of the matter is that, at least the way I see it, is that if we scale back on what we're buying, kind of end some of the corporate greed and some of the corporate messages, hey, if you don't buy this product, you're not helping climate change, that's where the problem is really starting, and that we don't need government officials and corporate leaders racing around in their jets to save humanity. There's just something fundamentally wrong with that. Okay, but we are going to hear them making statements about how humanity does need to work with nature, and how we need to learn to build our big towering cities in alignment with nature. Yes, we do need to change our civilization so that we are in alignment with nature. If we don't actually start doing some things that are going to be more in alignment with nature, such as ending some of the corporate greed, that nature is going to hand us one disaster after another until it forces humanity to be in alignment with nature and be harmonized with our planet. That is the one thing that we do need to learn to do, is to be in harmony with our planet. And one of those things, again, let's end corporate greed. All right, so we're going to hear that today also. We are also going to hear about what is happening in Gaza, leading back to, again, living in harmony with nature. That would mean that we need to find ways to end the wars that are happening there. We're going to hear about uprisings in cholera in the Middle East, and we're also going to hear that there is a confirmed case, both confirmed case of polio, the first confirmed case of polio in a very long time, as the war itself is uprooting and setting conditions for certain types of diseases to reappear. One of the reasons why we need to end the war and find peaceful solutions to our differences. So there is going to be in Gaza there is going to be a massive vaccination campaign to vaccinate the kids against polio and protect of course the global widespread of polio, because if we have a large number of kids in our world with such a disease, then there is a chance of it spreading around our planet again. So again, work with our planet in the wars, and we're probably going to be a lot better off. Okay, so why don't we go back to Ottawa, and we're going to listen to what Steven MacKinnon had to say about the railways and the binding arbitration.
Good afternoon, everyone. Je suis fier de faire partie d'un gouvernement qui est engagé envers le processus de négociation collective. La négociation collective n'est pas facile, mais lorsque les partis mettent le travail à la table, notre économie s'en sort toujours mieux. Dans les négociations actuelles entre la Compagnie des chemins de fer nationaux du Canada, le Canadien Pacifique de Kansas City et la Conférence ferroviaire des Teamsters Canada, une entente se fait toujours attendre. Après des mois de négociations, CN et CPKC ont commencé des lockouts, alors que les travailleurs de Teamsters au CPKC se sont mis en grève à minuit 1 ce matin. Ces négociations collectives appartiennent uniquement à CN, CPKC et à la Conférence ferroviaire de Teamsters Canada, mais les répercussions de l'impasse actuelle sont ressenties par l'ensemble des Canadiens. Et impasse, il y a. En tant que ministre du Travail, j'utilise les pouvoirs conférés en vertu du Code canadien du travail pour assurer la paix industrielle et offrir les solutions à court et à long terme, le tout dans l'intérêt national. En vertu de l'article 107 du Code canadien du travail, j'ai mandaté le Conseil canadien des relations industrielles afin d'aider les parties à régler les conditions en suspens de leur convention collective en imposant un arbitrage exécutoire final. J'ai également mandaté le Conseil afin qu'il prolonge la durée des conventions collectives actuelles jusqu'à ce que de nouvelles conventions soient signées et de faire reprendre immédiatement les activités des deux compagnies de chemin de fer. Des millions de Canadiens dépendent de nos chemins de fer tous les jours. Les travailleurs, les agriculteurs, les éleveurs, les navetteurs, les petites entreprises, les mineurs, les chimistes, les scientifiques, la liste est très longue et les impacts ne peuvent être sous-estimés. À l'échelle de l'ensemble du pays, d'ailleurs dans tous les coins de notre pays. Nos chemins de fer ont des répercussions sur l'eau que nous buvons avec l'expédition de chlore et ils aident à cultiver les aliments que nous mangeons avec de la potasse extraite pour l'engrais. Il est de la responsabilité du gouvernement d'assurer la paix industrielle dans ce secteur vital. Ainsi, nous examinerons pourquoi nous vivons des conflits répétés dans le secteur ferroviaire et les conditions qui ont conduit aux arrêts de travail simultanés que nous observons. Les Canadiens doivent avoir l'assurance que leur gouvernement ne les laissera pas souffrir lorsque les partis ne s'acquittent pas de leurs responsabilités envers eux à la table des négociations, surtout lorsque la sécurité des travailleurs et celle de la collectivité sont en jeu. Les accords négociés sont et seront toujours la meilleure façon d'aller de l'avant. La négociation collective est la façon dont les ententes les plus solides et les plus durables sont conclues. Des ententes qui sont bonnes pour les syndicats et pour les employeurs. Le Canada est une nation commerçante. Notre gouvernement fera tout tout ce qui est en son pouvoir pour préserver la stabilité et la certitude que nos chemins de fer et que l'ensemble de l'économie demeurent réputés dans le monde entier. I'll repeat it in English. I'm proud, obviously, to be part of a government that has done a lot for the labor movement and is committed totally to collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is not easy, but when parties put in the work at the table, our economy is always better off as a result. In the current collective bargaining negotiations between Canadian National Railway, Canadian Pacific Kansas City, and the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference, an agreement has so far proven elusive. After months of negotiations, CN Rail and CPKC began lockouts while Teamsters Canada rail workers at CPKC went on strike at 12:01 a.m. this morning. These collective bargaining negotiations belong to these parties, but their effects and the impacts of the current impasse are being borne by all Canadians. And there is an impasse. As Minister of Labour, I am using my authorities under the Canada Labour Code to secure industrial peace and deliver the short and long-term solutions that are in the national interest. Under Section 107 of the Canada Labour Code, I have directed the Canada Industrial Relations Board to assist the parties in settling the outstanding terms of their collective agreements by imposing final binding arbitration. I have also directed the Board to extend the term of the current collective agreements until new agreements have been signed and for operations on both railways to resume forthwith. Millions of Canadians rely on our railways every day. Workers, farmers, ranchers, commuters, small businesses, miners, chemists, scientists, the list goes on, and the impacts cannot be understated, and they extend to every corner of this country. Our railways have impacts on the water we drink with the shipment of chlorine, and they help grow the food we eat with potash mined for fertilizer. It is the government's responsibility to ensure industrial peace in this critically vital sector. Thus, we will be examining why we experience repeated conflicts in the railway sector and the conditions that led to the parallel work stoppages we are seeing. Canadians must be assured that their government will not allow them to suffer when parties do not fill their responsibility to them at the bargaining table, especially where worker and community safety is at stake. Negotiated agreements have and will always be the best way forward. Collective bargaining is how the strongest, longest-lasting deals are made, deals that are good for unions and employers alike. Canada is a trading nation. Our government will do everything in its power to preserve the stability and certainty that our railways and entire economy are renowned for the world over. Merci.
Okay, next up we're going to go, staying with Ottawa, of course, we're going to listen to what is happening as they're about to ramp up in the next few weeks or months with COP16, and this time it will be in, I believe in Colombia is what they're going to say. So let's listen to what the three ministers who are helping to lead off COP16 have to say.
On the road to COP16, and in that regard, we are delighted to have with us the principal actors that took us from COP15 to COP16 in this event. We have with us the Minister of Environment, the Honourable Steven MacKinnon, who's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada, with us seated in the middle. We also have with us the Honourable Susana Mohammed, the Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia, who is the incoming president for the COP16 meeting planned this fall in Cali, Colombia. And we have Astrid Schomacher with us, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And sitting right beside me here is David Cooper, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. The four of these people will be taking questions from you in today's meeting. J'aimerais annoncer les participants au panneau où nous avons le honorable Steven MacKinnon, ministre de l'Environnement et Changement climatique du Canada. Nous avons le ministre de l'Environnement et Développement durable du Colombie, l'honorable Susana Mohammed. Nous avons le secrétaire exécutif de la Convention sur la diversité biologique, Astrid Schumacher, et le député secrétaire exécutif de la Convention, David Cooper, juste à côté de moi. For this conference, we will have a period of about 30 minutes involving a few statements from some of the participants and answering questions. And then the ministers will have to leave, and then we'll have almost an annex to this conference where the executive secretary and the deputy will be there to take more technical questions on the formal political agenda, formal negotiating agenda taking place at COP16. But let me get started right now with the statements, and when I follow it, I'll talk about how we'll manage the questions. So for that, I'd like to begin with the Executive Secretary, Astrid Schumacher, who will set the scene for us. Astrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everybody. Minister Mohammed, Minister Guigaud, it's really a pleasure to welcome you here in the Secretariat. In a way, your presence symbolizes the continuity on the way to COP16 from COP15, and of course, that is a very, very important journey where we've started with unprecedented commitments and an unprecedented new understanding of the importance of biodiversity. And now, under your leadership, Minister Mohammed, the COP16 parties will have to demonstrate that they actually walk the talk. So they haven't just promised, but they put their promises into action. And in order to support this sort of movement for more biodiversity, the Colombian presidency has given us an excellent motto for the conference, Peace with Nature. It's going to be the theme of COP16. And we see that really as a powerful call to action. And of course, it also chimes in very nicely with the UN Secretary General's call to make peace with nature, which he described in a landmark address in December 2022, saying that making peace with nature is the defining task of the 21st century. And the way we see it, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the KMGBF, is actually the blueprint for making peace with nature. It has 4 goals, and these are about protecting and restoring nature, prospering with nature, sharing the benefits that nature brings to us fairly, and then investing and collaborating with nature. And all of these issues are on the agenda of COP16. Now, most importantly, and I already said it, is to demonstrate that COP15 has brought forward unprecedented action, just as COP15 itself was an unprecedented agreement. So we will be looking at COP15 and how countries have started their journey of implementation to 2030. This is done either via national biodiversity strategy and action plans, and then also targets that countries have to put forward. And the deadline for that is COP16, but we are pleased, for example, to say that already 61 parties have come forward with more than 1,500 targets, which we're now analyzing and can report on at COP16. Also very, very important will be that COP16 finishes the unfinished business from COP15, and there in particular, this is about access and benefit sharing on digital sequence information from genetic resources. Now, that's a very technical subject, but a very, very important one, also in terms of the mobilization of resources, but also in terms of the understanding of how we interact with nature, that when we take from nature, when we benefit from nature, we give back to nature. And it's about operationalizing the mechanism that was already agreed at COP15. And in addition to that, COP15 also made very, very ambitious promises on biodiversity finance. Now, the Global Environment Facility acted quickly. They set up the GBFF, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, and Canada has been leading the way with capitalizing the fund with $200 million. Some other countries have followed suit. We are hoping to see more action in that space in the run-up to COP16 and at COP16. And then COP16, and I've come slowly to a close, also includes initiatives that will bring the indigenous peoples and local communities to the table and elevate their voices and all the traditional knowledge they can bring to the debate. And I'm sure Minister Mohammed will speak of that. But they are also then part of the largest green zone that we have ever seen, where all actors of civil society can bring together their energy and their ideas of how we can move forward in the implementation of our framework. So Colombia's admirable efforts in ensuring this widest possible participation are really consistent with one of the main credos, I would say, of the framework, and that is that we can only achieve the framework if all parts of government work together, but also all parts of society come together, and we've had ample opportunity at COP16 to demonstrate how that can work. And I think I'll leave it at that and hand back over to David.
Great. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. Our Executive Secretary set the scene, and so now, as we are in Montreal, it's entirely fitting that we hear from Minister Guilbeault, who was representing Canada, hosting us here, hosting that great meeting where the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework came into being. So, Minister, I invite you to take the floor.
Merci, David. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Welcome to all. First, I would like to say that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederation. They are the traditional custodian and guardians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que j'aimerais vous présenter Madame Susana Mohamed, qui est la ministre colombienne de l'Environnement et du Développement durable. J'ai eu le plaisir de travailler avec elle déjà depuis plusieurs années. Et vous allez voir, pour ceux qui ne le savent pas encore, c'est une alliée, c'est une championne de la défense de l'environnement, de la protection de la nature, de la lutte au changement climatique et aussi des voix autochtones. Je pense qu'elle va nous en dire plus sur sa vision et celle de son gouvernement pour la COP16. So today we're passing the torch on the world's biggest nature protection conference. Minister Mohamed presiding over COP16 will be presiding over COP16 starting on October 21st in Cali, Colombia. And in the last 2 years, we've done a lot of work. There is a lot of work that needs to be done. Some of you will recall that in 2022, we didn't even know that we were going to be able to host COP16, let alone be able to come to the conclusion that many have called the Paris moment for nature. And we did that by working together in challenging times, and you know, it is as challenging now as it was then. But the only way we can get there is by working together. And the issues couldn't be as urgent as they were then. Species are still going extinct. We're still unsustainably using natural resources. We're not protecting critical habitats, and we've still not collectively realized that in the fight against climate change, our biggest ally is nature. But we did what very few thought was possible in 2002. We got 196 countries to agree to the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. And I think at the time, all countries said loud and clear, there's a better way to work with nature and to care for nature. Une nouvelle voie où nous pouvons collectivement répondre à la crise de la biodiversité, celle de la pollution, tout en soutenant des communautés fortes et durables partout à l'échelle de la planète. C'est certain qu'il est facile d'utiliser la peur pour bloquer les solutions. Et on voit des politiciennes faire ça partout sur la planète. Ces gens-là n'ont hélas aucune solution à offrir, que ce soit sur la protection de la nature, la lutte au changement climatique ou encore la lutte à la pollution plastique. Mais la COP15 nous a appris l'importance de travailler ensemble pour arriver à des résultats ambitieux. Comme on dit si bien en québécois, il faut que les bottines suivent les balais. Alors, depuis 2015, le Canada s'est engagé dans la plus grande campagne de protection de la biodiversité de l'histoire du pays. Je vous donne quelques chiffres, je ne veux pas vous inonder de ça, mais en 2015, lorsque notre gouvernement arrive au pouvoir, le Canada protège à peine 1% de nos océans et de nos espaces côtiers. Nous sommes à plus de 15%, presque 15% aujourd'hui. Nous protégeons 10% de nos territoires. Nous sommes à peu près à 14% aujourd'hui. J'ai bon espoir que d'ici la fin de l'année, au Canada, nous serons presque à 20% dans les deux cas, à la fois pour la protection terrestre et la protection maritime. Et on voit les impacts combinés des changements climatiques et de la surutilisation de nos ressources naturelles, que ce soit les feux de forêt, que ce soit les inondations. La science nous demande d'agir. Nous avons l'opportunité de bâtir une société et une économie qui soit plus durable, pour que les générations futures puissent en bénéficier. Nous avons présentement un plan au Canada de 12 milliards de dollars investis en matière de protection de la biodiversité. Et ce qui est vrai au niveau international l'est tout aussi au niveau canadien. C'est ensemble qu'on va réussir. L'ensemble des gouvernements, les provinces, les municipalités, les peuples autochtones, bien sûr le secteur privé et les ONG et bien d'autres. So in October, the world will look to Cali so that we can continue the work we started in Montreal. Countries, provinces, indigenous nations, cities, private sector, all partners must again come together to make progress on protecting the planet before it is too late. Together, we can find ways to mobilize, innovate, and respond to the biodiversity crisis. I'm happy now to pass it on to Minister Mohamed. Bienvenida, Ministra.
Muchas gracias, ministro. Un saludo a la secretaria, al Deputy Secretary. Gracias por nuestro recibimiento acá. Thank you for receiving us here in Montreal. And we have been expending 3 long days of actually going through all the negotiation processes and understanding.
Another long day today.
Yes. Understanding in depth what the negotiation will be about, but especially also working together with the Secretariat so we can fulfill a role as a host country and be able to welcome the world to move forward one step further regarding the global biodiversity framework. In this 21st century, and that's the main motivation why Colombia decided to host this conference, we see there is a double movement that humanity has to make. The first one is decarbonize and have that just energy transition. It has to be just, I emphasize. But on the other side of the coin is to restore nature and to allow nature to take again its power over planet Earth so that we can really, at the end, stabilize the climate. Otherwise, it will be something as one purpose is eating the other, meaning that if we are invest a lot in this process of nature recovery, but at the same time we are not decarbonizing, the climate will continue changing and nature will not have the time also to adapt. And if nature collapses, communities and people will also collapse. Society will collapse. And this is exactly the double movement that I think the world is not still conscious of. Still, climate has much more political awareness, economic investment, but we are not seeing the other side of the coin, and it's dangerous. That is dangerous for humanity. So one of our main purposes at COP16 in Cali is to make biodiversity and the global Kunming-Montreal framework as relevant politically, the same as currently the climate agenda is, and to bring awareness of the need that we all have, as the framework says, as a whole government and whole of society, to be able to mobilize the necessary action and implementation for these two movements to happen in order to be able to have humanity in safe limits during the 21st century. But we are also calling for peace with nature. And by that, Colombia means to have an in-depth reflection of how that transition is going to happen. We are calling for putting human rights at the center of this process of transition, because actually this change can be inclusive and it can bring economic and social benefits for millions of people around the world. And we are actually positioned to do that because we have now a global mandate that was agreed here in Montreal. But it means also that all of society can mobilize. It means that we need to rethink the way we live, and making peace with nature will be a central question of how we redefine business, how we redefine the economy, how we redefine the way we build cities, how we redefine the way we live. And if we incorporate, as Minister Guibault said, nature as our main ally, as actually a force for life, and change that relationship, that mental relationship of nature as a resource, but rather we come back to this ecosystem cycles, for sure we're going to be able to build some new perspectives on society. So how we're going to do this is by creating a participatory and action zone. We call it the green zone, where we have openly invited stakeholders to put their perspectives. We have divided that zone during the 12 days with 12 themes, and we have organized the proposal from stakeholders. We received in 1 month of opening 1,500 events that were proposed by 30 countries, and we will have indigenous people, women, youth, business people, and whole of society mobilizing to that action and participation zone. But we will connect that energy also to the blue zone, where the negotiation will be happening and where we have 4 main outcomes that we want to see, and that also Secretary Astrid already mentioned: the digital sequencing of information fund and framework, the Indigenous Peoples Work Program, the framework for implementation, how are we implementing, the reflection on implementation and the targets towards 2030, and of course the financial arrangements and mechanisms that would allow for that. The idea is actually that in the blue zone we will also have forums from stakeholders, but also we will bring those voices from the green zone so that we can fulfill one of our commitments as Colombian governments, that this will be people's call. And by that, we mean that we want to materialize that principle of the Kunming-Montreal framework, which is whole of society, whole of government mobilized. Hopefully, at the end of COP16, beyond the very successful negotiation processes and agreements by governments, the participation of many stakeholders, we can gather a new vision, a new energy that allows for a coalition, the Peace for Nature coalition, to start mobilizing around the world the energy required for this change to happen. So we are very excited. Lots of work happening at the moment, but very much looking forward to welcoming you all in Cali, Colombia.
Okay, so next up we're going to hear from the UN Security Council floor on the Gaza crisis and how it's actually fueling other tensions in the area.
I give the floor to Mr. Tor Wennesland.
Mr. President, members of the Council, I address you today with grave concern about the trajectory in the situation in the Middle East. The war in Gaza, with all its human tragedy, is serious risk of regional escalation, and the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict and continued occupation are combining to create a combustible situation in the whole of the Middle East. Our individual and collective capacity to manage or resolve this crisis are stretched beyond their limits. Any spark or miscalculation could set off a series of uncontrollable escalations, embroiling millions more in the conflict. We need a ceasefire now. We must continue all efforts to alleviate human suffering in the region. That means an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages in Gaza. It means diplomatic steps for de-escalation in the region, and it means irreversible moves towards re-establishing a political framework to end the conflict and establish a two-state solution. If any one of them remains unaddressed, then prospects for a more stable, peaceful and secure region will remain elusive. Mr. President, the war in Gaza continues to take a staggering toll on human life. In the more than 10 months of war since the horrific acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups on 7 October 23, more than 40,000 Palestinians and over 1,600 Israelis and foreign nationals have been killed. 109 Israelis are still held in Gaza, and the ones alive deny humanitarian visit. Tens of thousands of people have been injured, and vast majority of them Palestinians, including a staggering number of women and children. In Gaza, incidents of mass civilian casualties, airstrikes by Israel on schools and mosques sheltering the displaced, and the wanton destruction of civilian infrastructure are fueling suffering and violence, which is reverberating throughout the broader region. The indiscriminate launching of rockets by Hamas and other groups towards population centers in Israel continues. Civilian objects, including infrastructure and UN premises, are also reportedly being used to shield fighters and military objectives, endangering the lives of civilians around them. The lives of the remaining hostages are at grave risk. Many Palestinians in Gaza feel they have nowhere safe left to turn. Over the past months, around 200,000 Palestinians have been affected by evacuation orders. This is merely the latest round of a mass displacement in Gaza, where nearly 2 million people have been forced out of their homes and shelters during the war, most of them multiple times. 85% of the Strip has come under evacuation orders since 7 October. Mr. President, despite facing overwhelming challenges, UN agencies and humanitarian organizations continue to deliver life-saving assistance with remarkable courage to all available crossing points. However, their efforts are jeopardized by unsafe conditions on the ground, which are exacerbated by a complete breakdown of law and order. If these unacceptable conditions are allowed to prevail, humanitarian operations in Gaza will continue to fall short of meeting the massive needs of the population. Mr. President, the scale of destruction is immense and it will take years, if not decades, to recover. The UN is working to repair and improve almost entirely defunct water, sanitation and hygiene systems in Gaza. The 5 wastewater treatment plants have shut down and 5 out of 6 solid waste management facilities are damaged. The Palestinian Ministry of Health just confirmed the first cases of polio in 25 years. 1.6 million doses of polio vaccine have been released for a campaign scheduled to begin on 31st of August. The UN estimates nearly 40 million tons of debris have been generated in this conflict. Clearing the debris from key areas alone is estimated to take at least 5 years. Mr. President, while the eyes of the international community are focused on Gaza, the occupied West Bank is a tinderbox of violence and tension. Israeli security forces continue to carry out large-scale operations in Area A, including targeting Hamas, PIJ and other armed groups in densely populated refugee camps and Palestinian urban centers. These operations often result in lethal exchanges with these groups, in adding to the killing or injuring of bystanders. Fatal attacks by Palestinian militants on Israelis in the West Bank and in Israel continued, including a failed bombing attack claimed by Hamas and PIJ in Tel Aviv on 19 August. The Israeli settler rampage in the Palestinian village of Jit near Nablus that killed 1 Palestinian, critically injured others on 15 August was yet another illustration of the violent consequences of settlement expansions in the occupied West Bank and the persistent lack of accountability for such crimes. Inflammatory rhetoric and provocative acts are further inflaming the situation. In recent days, we have seen Hamas threaten to launch a new campaign of suicide bombings. We have also seen 2 Israeli ministers, alongside hundreds of Israelis, visit the Holy Esplanade on the Jewish holiday of Tish B'Av. Let me be clear. If we are to prevent yet another spiraling escalation, the violence must end. There are no justification for acts of terror, civilians must be protected, and the incitement must stop. Any violation of the status quo at the holy sites must also be firmly rejected. Mr. President, the war in Gaza and the deteriorating situation in the occupied West Bank are continuing in the context of a wider regional tension and the threat of even more serious escalation. Across the blue line and beyond, exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah continue to intensify, particularly following the recent strike at Mashd al-Shams in the Israeli-occupied Golan, while resulted in the killing of 12 children, followed by a subsequent strike in the southern suburbs of Beirut that killed a senior Hezbollah commander. In the wider region, several fatal events exacerbated tension. Aerial attacks towards Israel from various locations across the region that Israel has attributed to Iran-backed forces, including a Houthi drone strike in Tel Aviv, Israeli strike that targeted Hudaydah port infrastructure in response, and the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas Politburo in Tehran. Mr. President, with all of these negative trends, and after more than 300 days of war in Gaza, we are at an inflection point in the Middle East. A ceasefire and hostage release deal in Gaza is imperative now for regional peace and security. I have continued to emphasize that message in support of regional de-escalation in discussions with all relevant parties and member states in the region, including Lebanon, Egypt, and Qatar. I commend the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and US, for their continued relentless efforts in Doha and in Cairo this week. I urge the parties to reach a deal in the coming days. There is simply no time to lose. The UN remain committed and ready to scale up humanitarian assistance during a ceasefire and supporting implementation of a deal. Only a sustained ceasefire can enable a full-scale humanitarian and early recovery response in Gaza. Mr. President, the profound social, economic and political fallout from the devastation is yet to be seen and comprehended. We must work to put in place as soon as possible the political and security framework necessary to more ably address the humanitarian crisis, start early recovery, and eventually rebuild Gaza, as well as changing the negative dynamic at the West Bank. These political and security frameworks, even ones that are considered transitional, cannot be divorced from the context of the ongoing Israeli occupation and unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are no shortcuts and no quick fixes. Security and governance are intrinsically linked and must be addressed in tandem to achieve a lasting peace in Gaza and address the West Bank situation. It is imperative that we establish a comprehensive political framework that is accepted by Palestinian population and addresses the legitimate aspirations and grievances while also addressing Israel's legitimate security concern. The UN will strongly support this work. This framework must facilitate a Palestinian government that can effectively govern both Gaza and the occupied West Bank and ensure stability and security across the occupied Palestinian territory. The Palestinian Authority must be at the center of governance in the occupied Palestinian territory. There is simply no credible alternative. However, to achieve this and to promote a more durable and credible model of governance to ensure stability and security for Palestinians in Israel, Palestinians and Israelis, steps must be taken by all parties and by the international community to strengthen and support the PA. Violence in the occupied West Bank needs to be significantly reduced, including violence taking place in the context of scaled-up Israeli security operations. Palestinian security forces need to be supported and empowered to carry out their responsibility fully. Israeli measures that weaken the PA need to be urgently addressed, including IDF operations in Area A, settlement expansion, settler violence, and extreme financial pressure. The international community must work together to address the PA's persistent financial crisis, strengthen its capacity, and enable its return to Gaza. Recent commitments from the World Bank and the European Union offer the promise of relief, but will not resolve the precarity of the PA's financial situation. We must work together to strengthen the ability of the PA to meet the needs of their people. Most importantly, for any of these efforts to be credible and durable, a political horizon must be re-established. Security fixes alone will not lead to a more stable future for anyone in the region. But let us not be naive about what is required. It will take concerted effort from committed leaders from the region and the international community. It may also require us to rethink how we get there. The steps I've outlined above, which are informed by the principles I outlined to you in May, are a start. Mr. President, finally, ultimately the only path of these vicious circles of despair is a political horizon that will end the occupation and achieve a two-state solution. Israel and an independent, democratic, continuous, viable and sovereign Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security with secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-67 lines with Jerusalem as the capital of both. The United Nations will continue to support all efforts towards this goal. I thank you.
Okay, so we're going to hear an update from the UN press floor in New York City, as they're going to talk about Gaza versus polio, Sudan, and Libya, and topics from the Middle East and around the world.
All right, good afternoon. Our Secretary General arrived in Auckland in New Zealand a few hours ago. Tomorrow he will meet with the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Christopher Luxon, before heading to the Pacific Islands, the Pacific Island Forum, which is taking place, as you all know, in Tonga. Earlier today in Apia in Samoa, the Secretary General with members of civil society, including youth groups, women's groups, and representatives of people with disabilities. They all took part in an intergenerational dialogue ahead of the Summit of the Future. Participants share their perspectives about the Summit of the Future. Their views will feed into the government preparations for and engagement at events that will take place in September right here at the headquarters of the United Nations. Meanwhile, on her final day of her visit to Mongolia, our Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed met with the Prime Minister of Mongolia, Oyun Erden Lufsansarai, After the closing ceremonies of the World Women's Forum, Ms. Mohammed visited a service center for victims of gender-based violence that is being run by the UN Population Fund. She expressed her appreciation for the dedication, the commitment, and the tireless effort of service providers in delivering crucial care and services to survivors for their advocacy against such violence. The Deputy Secretary General also visited a herder family in their traditional home to learn about their livelihood and the impact of climate change and modernization on their nomadic way of life. Ms. Mohammed will depart Mongolia on Saturday. Turning to Gaza, our colleagues at the World Health Organization are warning that disrupted water and sanitation systems in Gaza, including at hospitals, are increasing the risk of infectious diseases. WHO has procured more than $400,000 worth of infection prevention and control supplies, including chlorine tablets, hygiene products, and gloves. These items have already been delivered to 5 hospitals, with plans to reach 2 others in the coming weeks. However, we keep sounding the alarm that repeated evacuation orders continue to severely disrupt aid operations in Gaza. Meanwhile, our partners say the amount of food assistance that has entered southern Gaza in July was one of the lowest recorded in the last 10 months. They warn that active hostilities, damaged roads, access constraints, and a lack of public order and safety have led to critical food shortages. Children are paying the heaviest price, with poor diet and the decimation of healthcare services and water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure, raising the risks of malnutrition and disease. Our partners are working to provide nutrition. Those of our partners who are working on the nutrition issues say the number of children in northern Gaza who were diagnosed with acute malnutrition soared by over 300% last month as compared to May, and by more than 150% in the south of the Gaza Strip. Without unfettered humanitarian access that allows major scale-up of support, hunger and malnutrition will only worsen. Those hot meals reached an estimated, World Food Program tells us that as of a week ago, the agency had reached some 370,000 people with partial food parcels and wheat flour this month. However, distribution in Rafah is unfortunately rare due to the ongoing fighting. WFP also distributed 4.4 million hot meals across Gaza so far this month, and that was done through about 60 community kitchens. Those meals reached an estimated 78,000 people, most of them in Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah area. OCHA also reports that in July, the percentage of humanitarian movements denied by Israeli authorities more than doubled from 7 to 15%, severely hampering efforts to quickly reach people with critical support. This is despite the overall number of humanitarian missions coordinated by the Israeli authorities increasing from 414 in June to more than 540 in July. Meanwhile, OCHA says as of yesterday, 43% of nearly 150 planned humanitarian assistance missions to northern Gaza were facilitated by Israeli authorities this month. The rest were either denied, impeded, or canceled due to various reasons, including security, logistical, and operational reasons. And in southern Gaza, less than half of the 280 coordinated aid movements have been facilitated by the IDF in August. Turning to the polio situation in Gaza, as you will have seen, WHO confirmed yesterday that a 10-month-old baby in Deir al-Balah has polio. It's the first case in 25 years. Just to avoid confusion, this is a case that was already flagged by the Ministry of Health in Gaza earlier, but this was now confirmed by the WHO yesterday. Given the risk of polio spreading in Gaza and the wider region, WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA, as well as many other partners, are preparing 2 rounds of polio vaccination campaigns for children under the age of 10. The first round will provide vaccinations for over 600,000 children, and the second round will commence 4 weeks after the first. WHO is sending more than 1 million polio vaccines to Gaza, which will be administered in the coming weeks. UNRWA's health teams are committed to lead this upcoming vaccination against polio. Colleagues at UNRWA say they insist that on vaccinating children in both UNRWA's healthcare facilities and mobile health points within its shelters. Additionally, UNRWA mobile teams will visit communities tent to tent to vaccinate children unable to actually go to health facilities. UN agencies request all parties to the conflict to implement a humanitarian pause in Gaza for 7 days to provide this urgent health care and to protect children in Gaza from polio. These pauses in fighting would allow children and families to safely reach health facilities and community outreach workers to get children who cannot access health facilities for polio vaccination. Without humanitarian pause, the delivery of this campaign will be that much more challenging. Turning to Sudan, our humanitarian colleagues tell us that flooding is heightening the risk of cholera and that it will continue to spread. WHO says that in a month since the first suspected cases were reported, more than 650 cases and 28 deaths have been reported in 5 states, primarily in Kassala, which is in the east of the Sudan. UN refugee agencies particularly worried about the spread of the disease in areas hosting refugees and internally displaced people, mainly in Kassara, Gadaref, and Al Jazeera states. At 3 refugee sites, nearly 120 cholera cases have been confirmed, as reported by Sudan's Ministry of Health, and 5 refugees have died. UNHCR is working with their colleagues at WHO, with humanitarian partners, and the Sudanese health authorities to scale up prevention and response efforts. These include providing beds, medicines, and hygiene supplies at treatment facilities in Kassala. WHO says an initial cholera vaccination campaign in Kassala has reached more than 50,000 people. Upwards of 450,000 additional doses of oral cholera vaccines are in the pipeline to be delivered. WHO has also pre-positioned cholera kits and other essentials medical supplies in high-risk states. WHO stresses that to launch and maintain a robust response to the cholera outbreak, healthcare workers need safe and unhindered access to all affected areas, as well as sustained financial support. Turning to Libya, our political mission there has called for an immediate de-escalation following reports of mobilizations of forces in the capital, Tripoli. The mission says that there are threats to use of force to resolve crisis concerning the central bank of Libya. Our colleagues say they're actively engaging with relevant stakeholders to reach a peaceful settlement and resolve the crisis. It reiterates that the display of military power in armed confrontation in densely populated neighborhoods is unacceptable and threatens the lives of civilians. Also want to flag that this morning we shared with you a press statement from the UN Peacebuilding Commission. It relates to a meeting which focused on Liberia's peace-building and sustaining peace priorities, in particular transitional justice and youth inclusion. The meeting took place earlier this week. And I want to flag a humanitarian crisis that we've not spoken about very much, and that is in Namibia, which is facing the worst drought in 100 years. Our acting emergency relief coordinator, Joyce Masuya, allocated $3 million from the Central Emergency Fund to support the government-led response to this crisis. 84% of Namibia's food reserves are already exhausted, and nearly half of the population is expected to experience high levels of food insecurity between July and September. That's what the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System is telling us. The drought is contributing to an increase in severe acute malnutrition among children under 5, with deaths already reported in some regions. Our humanitarian colleagues say that women and girls who are required to walk longer distances to collect food and water, the risk of being subjected to gender-based violence also increases. The World Food Programme, UNICEF, the UN Population Fund will use the money allocated from the Central Emergency Response Fund to support more than 163,000 people. This will take the form of cash assistance, treatment for acute malnutrition, rehabilitation of water supply points, and assistance for survivors of gender-based violence. And I was asked offline about the situation in Venezuela and the announcement made by the Venezuelan Electoral Chamber of the Supreme Court regarding the results of the presidential elections. I can tell you that the Secretary General takes note of the decision taken by the Supreme Court. We understand that the National Electoral Council has still not released the election results by polling stations. The Secretary General continues to call for complete transparency in that regard, and he reiterates his call for the full protection and respect of human rights and continues to urge all parties to resolve any electoral disputes through peaceful means. He is concerned about reports of human rights violations, including alleged arbitrary detention of minors, journalists, human rights defenders, members or supporters of the opposition, and others. He recalls that everyone has the right to hold opinions without interference, to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Today is the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. On this day, the head of UNESCO, Audrey Azoulay, calls on all to remember the victims and freedom fighters of the past so they may inspire future generations to build just societies.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.